Good evening. You're watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. My name is Eric Kirk. I've got Dr. Aaron Donaldson with me this week as Dave is out, and we are going to talk political news of the day. You would think that politics are slowing down for the holidays. They're not. We've got the January committee report, which just came out with referrals. Criminal referrals for Donald Trump and Mr. Eastman, who was sort of the architect, such as it was, of a very sloppy plan. And we will also be discussing the 1.7 trillion omnibus spending package that has some interesting items to it. And then in our third segment, we will discuss Zelinsky's trip to Washington. Ukraine's prime minister came here to plead for money and continued solidarity, and apparently has received it. We will discuss all three of those tonight, starting with the January 6th committee. No real surprises as far as I could see. It was all pretty much the same information. They replayed some of the old information. Donald Trump, clearly wanted to, they according to the findings, bypass the election, bypass democracy. Had a really kind of convoluted plan that maybe wasn't all that well put together, involving basically sowing chaos and hoping to be able to somehow in that hold on to power. But of course, he was challenging the election. He knew or should have known that he actually lost the election, refused to acknowledge that publicly. And the hearing began because of the storming of the Capitol, which was a very violent affair. It actually did cost some lives. It could have cost lives of members of Congress, possibly the vice president. All part of a plan that was concocted by Eastwood to possibly get alternate electors in, invalidate the election for 8 states, I believe it was, and to stick his guy into the Department of Justice to maybe make some decisions there. It's not really clear what Trump was thinking, but he definitely was not intending to hand over power. A lot to discuss. What was the fallout? Of course, the two Republicans involved in the January 6th committee, neither Kinzinger nor Liz Cheney, are returning to Congress next year, but they both had plenty to say. Hard to even know where to start. Aaron, what have you got to say on this?
I think that you're right, that Trump's whole strategy is convoluted, and in other contexts would be pretty ridiculous if it didn't end in such a harrowing moment for not only democracy, but also, as you mentioned, the lives of elected representatives, the lives of Capitol Police. Like, this was a really drastic moment in our history, and what was exactly motivating that is unclear. As you said, the committee does a very good job of establishing a timeline that Donald Trump did know that he was surrounded by people that were telling him that he lost, and that is in fact the case. And rather than listen, his goal was to find people that would, encourage the so-called big lie. What is not convoluted are the 4 different charges that the committee did vote on: obstruction of unofficial proceeding, and to me, if we can link his speech to the mob that went to the Capitol and quote, fought like hell, which are his words, then that to me is reasonable. I'm not, you're a lawyer, so you know whether this would work or not, but the debate coach in me is like, this is a pretty straightforward argument. The second is the conspiracy to defraud the United States. That's pretty straightforward if you look at all of the people around him under oath saying that we told him that he lost and he had no real reason to believe we were lying. Conspiracy to make a false statement is a different thing, and conspiracy to defraud the United States by assisting, aiding, or comforting those involved in an insurrection. And I just really want to emphasize Liz Cheney's remarks for the final vote were succinct. They were clear. They were praised by all sorts of people on the left and the right in terms of her perspective on history, and also the sacrifice that she has had to make as a professional politician to be on the right side of it. And the one thing that she really stressed that I think bears repeating is that we have to just stop and realize that even if there's no criminal charges that are filed as a result, we now live in a world where a congressional committee has recommended a federal charge, a charge against a president for conspiring to defraud the United States. This is a major moment in history that feels a little flat if we don't keep it in perspective.
Definitely. I mean, this is a a precedent that could really be bad if there isn't a follow up. And there's a lot of questions as to whether or not the Department of Justice is going to follow up. I've seen a lot of talking heads saying, well, it has the appearance of being partisan, and because it's all the Democrats and a couple of Republicans that didn't like Trump. First of all, they supported Trump for the longest time.
Right.
Until their lives were threatened. Now, Liz Cheney snapped out of it on January 6th. Jim Jordan tried to take her arm, and she said, "F you're responsible for this." And Jim Jordan was actually referred as one of several members of Congress for his failure to honor the subpoenas and respond to the committee. About 4 or 5 Republicans, not Mo Brooks, curiously enough, but others, for refusing to cooperate, referred to the ethics committee, which will probably go nowhere. It'll probably, just fade out. But the referral itself is there for history. A number of attorneys have been referred for bar discipline in their various states, including the one that told Cassidy, I'm forgetting her last name, to lie, basically. Hutchins, yeah. In fact, he could get disbarred. He acted just like a mob lawyer. I mean, it was really, that
really
was
alarming.
Yeah, I mean, and so you've got a bunch of referrals there. Eastman only has got 2 criminal referrals. He doesn't have the incitement and to insurrection one that Trump has. But the big question is this going to lead to prosecution? And legal scholars say it has to. You've got to not worry about the appearance of it being that, because quite frankly, one of the things that I haven't yet read about in the report is, they have what part of what the committee was supposed to investigate is why the FBI and the DC police didn't act on this. And again, I think it was all about appearance. They didn't want to appear to be anti-Trump. They didn't, all of this. And there's just all this tiptoeing around, wanting to appear partisan because Trump has been so normalized. It's just basically he's like the Republican Party. So therefore, it's partisanship to stand up to him. And we're just at that point of insanity. And I hope that they've got the right guy in there as Attorney General. He seems really cautious so far. We don't know. On the other hand, he seems really interested. They are investigating. He's got a special prosecutor on this. But the long-term consequences, if there is no follow-up on this, means that somebody smarter than Trump next time will pull something like this. And even with the Electoral College Act passing, the point is that Trump for 4 years strained the systems of checks and balances in this country, stretched them to the point where they could have broken, and they could have broken on that day. Go ahead.
There's 2 currents coming together here. I think you're right that the normalization of Trump is a significant component of the tiptoeing that we see. I think that there's a demonization of the left, the usage of the term Democrat and liberal as associated with an enemy of the state, or as someone who just cannot ever be trusted under any circumstance. This is pretty old rhetoric that predates Trump, and that really enables him to frame pretty much anything that any Democrat in any circumstance, and any Republican, including apparently Liz Cheney, who works with a Democrat, he can frame all of that as mere partisanship and just the Democrats being nasty and being ugly. And that's what he's going to do. And his base is going to believe it, because that history is the kind of soil that his big lie is really planted in. Democracy Now! Had Christina Greer from Fordham University and Dr. Cornel West on, and they both had very, very similar reactions to whether the DOJ would, try to pursue any of these charges. They've obviously got their own investigation going on, which could be even more substantial in some ways. And one of the things that Cornel West said is that, Trump is promising violence if he goes to jail, and that could be kind of part of the point. when you're looking at like a neo-fascist state, if you get off the hook with your crime, then you succeed and you win. If you get framed as a criminal and thrown in jail, then that actually in many ways kind of elevates your standing amongst your base. It really elevates your position as someone who's, prosecuted by what he would call the so-called deep state and things like that. It's risky. It is a very risky moment. And yet if they do nothing, then we all in broad daylight saw a sitting U.S. president wipe his feet with the Constitution and send an angry mob to fight like hell to Congress and break into the building, and nothing is going to happen. That strains our credibility as a nation of rule and laws, and that's something we tend to kind of pride ourselves on.
And there's a real rich history of what happens when you don't stand up to authoritarianism at the right moment. I mean, you've got to do it.
You have to take unequivocal stances. You have to take really, really like unequivocal stances, and it's hard to see that going on right now.
But it's frustrating because, I'm watching even so-called liberal CNN and ABC News and the rest. They've got their talking hosts up like this is like a partisan issue to discuss. It doesn't matter that there are millions of people who are following this guy. That's not what makes it, gives it legitimacy. I'm sorry. That's not the issue. You got to determine, when you're in the media, whether or not this is consistent with the ideals and the tradition of the nation, and whether we're breaking away from it. And if that is happening, then it needs to be called out, even if it means you're marginalizing your markets more. I'm sorry, that's
you see a real caution with the language on Trump. And Christina Greer on that same segment when Democracy Now! Was saying too many people are comparing him to like Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon resigned because he didn't want to be impeached. And Donald Trump indicted a mob to storm the Capitol. I mean, these are very, very different people. And in the age of Nixon, especially, but also in that particular circumstance, I think that the proof is in the pudding that if you kind of soft pedal it in the name of speaking to a specific political group, like a voting bloc of pure Nixon Republicans in that case, and to kind of coddle a big ego that needs a soft way off, that worked. Like they soft talked Nixon and he walked himself out the door rather than be impeached. But when you soft talk folks like Donald Trump, or I would say Ron DeSantis, you continue to normalize a lot of that behavior in ways that has very material consequences. And they can claim that they're not accountable, but their discourse is clear. Their reputation amongst their voters is established.
Yeah, but, of course, of the 10 Republicans in the House who voted for impeachment the second time around, I'm not sure about the first, only 2 are returning to Congress. But, there's a few lessons that need to be learned here. First of all, Kinzinger wasn't out there didn't leave because of Trump. He got left out because the Democrats have basically gerrymandered his district into non-existence.
Right.
Liz Cheney
is the one that really ate it because of her stance on Donald Trump, and boy did she eat it! She was the rising star of the party until she wasn't. I think that the point about Liz Cheney's fall is a pretty significant one, and you said that that's Wyoming. I think it's an investment in a Trump base that is very, very particular to being primarily anti-establishment and less issue-driven. I feel like on the issues for Republicans, Liz Cheney is golden, but she's not striking the right tone when it comes to like bucking the liberals and bucking the insiders and all of those things, because she will stand for the rule of law when she has to, and that's what made a big difference in her case, I think.
We've talked about on our show, on this very show, the fact that, hey, she also voted for waterboarding and, a lot of other things. I mean, I
defended her dad's legacy of torture and on.
You're right. I mean, I want to praise her to a certain extent, but
feels weird.
Only so far. But that's not why she wasn't voted out. They'll use that against her.
Correct.
But that's not why she was voted out. And so we have this situation in the Republican Party where they can't live with Trump and can't live without him. And so and you had 7 Republicans vote for impeachment the second time around. I mean, that is the most bipartisan an impeachment has been in our history, I think. But they needed 3 or 4 more. I forget exactly how much, and they and they didn't get it. And again, we've got the impact of this report. Where is it going to go? Is it going to have any impact? Are the Republicans even privately talking about what to do about it? But it's just this was such a serious thing, and you hear all kinds of people, and you can put up videos talking to Trump supporters, and they will deny that violence occurred, and I will have the video right there, and they will refuse to click it. They just do not want. The line is there was no violence. The only violence that happened was Antifa, provocateurs, and despite zero evidence of that. Zero, absolutely none. I mean, they've thrown a couple things in that have been totally debunked, and they brought arms, and this is a real serious thing. And quite frankly, I look at DeSantis, and he scares me more than Trump because he's got a brain. He knows how to do politics. He has basically taken Florida. It is not a battleground state right now.
One of the things that I find especially aggravating about some of the supporters of Donald Trump is that they will be so explicit in their rhetoric of intending to start things like a civil war, wanting to overthrow the government, wanting to support their Second Amendment rights. They attach hashtag 2A to all sorts of their political commentary. And yet when they literally initiate push coming to shove and violence at our Capitol, they're not courageous enough to stand up for their own violent advocacy. They chicken out. They talk about how, that had to be Antifa when they themselves have been the one preaching this revolution on this particular cause. Like, this is not, the Confederacy. This is not a rebellion I'm afraid of. It's a bunch of, frankly, kind of people that are too scared to stand up for what they ultimately believe in. But what this there's 154-page introductory material to the final report that I encourage people to read. The beginning pages, the first 4 pages are just 15 quick points that are unequivocal. Donald Trump's a criminal, and the DOJ's got to pursue it.
And the mayor was definitely intoxicated. There were suggestions by, I believe it was Mayor Giuliani, to go and declare victory and say that we won it outright.
It was far too early to be making any calls like that. Ballots were still being counted.
I don't know that I had a firm view as to what he should say in that circumstance. The results were still being counted.
Did you ever share, Mr. Kushner, your view of Mr. Giuliani? Did you ever share your perspective about him with the president?
I guess, yes.
Tell me what you said.
Basically, not the approach I would take if I was you.
We were getting ready to win this election. Frankly, we did win this election.
All right. Well, we have, again, it looks like we're not going to have a shutdown anytime soon of the government. I think the Republicans may have learned a lesson from this election that they don't want to just be cavalier about it. They may, shut down the government at a future point in time, but we do have a spending bill, a $1.7 trillion bill, more than half of it going to the military. Nobody wants to talk about the inflationary impact of that. We've discussed that on prior shows. But it did pass. There were some threats from some of the right-wing members of the House and a couple people in the Senate, but it did pass. The government will remain open for this time. There's a lot to get into it. Tucked within it is also, I believe they refer to it as the Electoral College count bill, which now law, which basically revises how the count is done. It clarifies that the vice president does not actually have authoritative power to reject the votes, the Electoral College votes of any particular state. His acceptance of it is merely ceremonial, and or hers in the case it will be next time. And the other thing it passed is it increased the threshold of an ability to basically object to electors. Now, we know that there were fake electors being proposed here. They wanted Pence to basically state that he was invalidating it and maybe have to go to court as to whether or not he had the power to do that. But a lot of people believe that the vice president had the constitutional power to do that, and even the ceremonial power was just granted by Congress in the 19th century. It didn't give him any real power on this. So this clarified that. That was in the bill. A lot of political significance of the passing of this. Title 42, which was addressing what's happening on the border, got rejected from it. We'll talk a little bit about it, but Aaron, why don't you jump in at this point and talk about, why don't we start with just the significance of it itself?
I mean, it's an interesting bill. It did pass, fairly close to the deadline for a government shutdown, but by today's standards, I think we can call this a fairly surprising act of bipartisanship, just in terms of the margin of support that we see, rather than sticking to their typical principles and risking a government shutdown. A whole lot of Republicans just voted for this thing. And I think it's interesting that you note that there's probably some kind of lingering after effect of the midterm there, whereas maybe they just feel a little bit safer making those votes, just not seeing a particular kind of red wave materialize. I don't know. I think that's an interesting question. But as far as the Electoral Count Act, go ahead.
And real quickly, there are a lot of, the margin in the House is Republicans who barely got in with the skin of their teeth, who tend to be more moderate to even be able to win in those competitive districts, and they probably don't want to go down with the ship.
Right. I think that's a really good point. And I think that if the red wave would have materialized, there could have been a lot more for them to stand on and say, we're not going to vote for this, which could have pushed us closer to that, brink or brinksmanship that they like to play on. The Electoral Count Act, I think, is really interesting. We talked at the top about how it was just this really convoluted plan that Donald Trump had that didn't really make any sense, and that ultimately boiled down to this kind of harebrained idea that they could just interrupt the Senate proceeding and therefore somehow stop the election or make a new election. I don't know. But it's a good example of where, people will really exploit vague language. There was no legal precedent, and in fact, quite a few legal precedents, as I'm sure you could explain, that counteracted the idea that the vice president as a single person could just say, we're going to do this election over, or, oh, I don't know, I don't trust this slate of electors because of a pillow salesman, so we're not going to do it anymore. There's no premise there to believe that, but the language was vague enough. And here we saw, it's not a rebuke of Trumpism, but it's definitely realizing that people are going to play off of this kind of vocabulary, so they tried to clarify it a little bit. I think it was interesting that the way that one of the provisions was framed is, the particular provision that's we cannot define a failed election is protecting the popular vote. And that's a story that I think gets lost here a lot. Obviously, Democrats are going to be upset if someone's like, my candidate lost the election, but we did not lose the election. But a lot of Republican votes would have been invalidated if Trump's scheme would have gone through, and not enough Republicans are upset about that. If he were to overdo the entire election the way that he wanted to and do that one over, it could have implicated a whole bunch of Republican seats and things. And so by phrasing it as protecting the popular vote, it's a really good example of bipartisan framing, something that hopefully everyone can get behind, that was pretty necessary.
Yeah, no, it definitely. I think Republicans wanted it too, because we know that a lot of Republicans, we've discussed that before, that privately hate his guts.
Oh yeah,
and
really antithetical to most of what the party stood for right up until the day he took office.
Well, and not only that, twice now in 2 years, he's cost them the Senate majority.
Oh yeah.
Particularly in Georgia. So it's just he's pushed candidates on them that they don't like. So this was not just a rebuff of him, but they want to avoid this. They do not want this to happen later. But the interesting thing is that there was supposed to be a Title 42 issue. There was going to be a deal on that, and they'll probably, I think they voted on separately. Is that correct? Or we're going to? Is that what happened there? Do you know?
I'm not exactly sure. It looks like, so we're getting to note that they did agree that they're going to vote on that separately, and I think it makes sense. I think that it was, that's something that they're going to do with an issue that, coming as it is on the heels of a whole bunch of wall rhetoric and a whole bunch of like so-called caravan rhetoric. The border is just another one of those red hot issues. And rather than try to strike a deal so close to a shutdown, they're like, we got to pull this one out and deal with it some other time. And it's one that impacts Democrats a lot too, I think.
I mean, Title 42. That's been, this is the Trump era policy, zero tolerance, and the rest that Biden has tried to abandon, has run into problems with the courts, finally got it abandoned, and Republicans wanted to call for it being maintained in the bill if they were going to, to have a cut in the funding of the Department of Homeland Security if they didn't maintain this policy, and that got rejected. It wasn't in the bill. It's not law. Yeah.
What's interesting to me is, there was $722 billion or so in non-defense spending, $858 billion in additional defense spending. It is continually just a broken record, but very alarming to me that we continue to increase the defense spending to the extent that we do when we have so many different things happening. When you look at Chairman Patrick Leahy's note on the omnibus bill and just how the priorities for Democrats shook out, it sounds pretty good on their issues. But when you look at the whole piece of the pie, that's less than half of the whole piece of the pie. And there's more than half of that going to additional defense spending. $858 billion of defense spending is something that's really hard for people to wrap their minds around. The only metaphor I reach to is to tell people that 1,000,000 seconds is 12 days, 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. There's a huge difference between 1,000,000 and 1,000,000,000. And when we're looking at $858 billion of additional defense spending, when we have coastal and inland areas threatened by climate change, when we have educational systems in this country that have completely been rattled and stripped by COVID, and the requirement that now we're like hybrid learning and things without any infrastructure. You look at the state of American healthcare, the state of our hospitals. You could just go on and on and on with the list. People are going to say that defense spending is what keeps us safe at night. I think that the jury's still out on that. One thing I do know is it's theft. It's theft from the American people in a lot of ways.
It's inflationary, even though it's capital intensive industry, but it maintains an industry, and it's what the President Eisenhower referred to as part of the congressional military industrial complex, because a lot of times they're pushing weapons that the Pentagon doesn't even strategically want, because if somebody, some key person on some committee has got, about 5,000 jobs at stake if that weapon isn't being made. This is not about security. It's a racket.
It's capital intensive, and when you look at the capitalism that it intensifies, we're talking about Boeing, we're talking about Raytheon, we're talking about weapons manufacturers, and in order to increase demand, we have to start wars, we have to fund conflicts. The speech that you're talking about is infamous. We talk about it all the time in public speaking, and he does in fact say that this is freedom on a cross of iron in that speech, because that is the sacrifice. This is the famous speech where he lists how many brick schoolhouses you could build with a bomber and things like that. And when Republicans talk about, how they're the party of fiscal conservatism, again, it's a broken record here. But Democrats are just as guilty. I think there are a lot of Democrats that would say that they held their nose and voted on this defense package and the increase in defense package. Everything I'm reading from the early reporting is like that was a big part of that negotiation, was to get that 10% increase to certain components of the defense spending in the bill. And it has become so normalized, especially since 9/11. Before 9/11, debaters were saying that we wanted single-payer health care, and everyone said $500 billion was too expensive. Since 9/11, $500 billion can go to defense seemingly every year, and we just decide that that's worth it.
Yeah, I mean, they were talking about, of course, Manchin screaming about how inflationary Build Back Better was, because it was going to be $3 trillion or $1.5 trillion, but it was going to be spent over 10 years. This is, almost $1 trillion in 1 year just on quote unquote defense alone. No, it's
And
obscene.
it's on things that add value. It's on things that add value. When you spend money on infrastructure, that helps our economy. When you spend money on healthcare, that helps our economy. People that owned a whole lot of our economic bonds, like folks like China and things, they hate our war effort. They love when we talk about socializing healthcare because that makes their money worth more. That adds value to our economy. Raytheon does not do that.
Yeah, no, it's pretty sad when the Republican president of the 1950s is to the left of half our Democrats today, at least on economic issues in the military. I mean, that's just
Yeah. And people say that progressivism is tearing this country apart. It's shocking and it's alarming. And yet this bill is supposed to be a win for bipartisanship. Like, part of me wants to sit here and say, thank goodness we didn't have a government shutdown, Eric. But at the same time, when you look at what's in this bill, it's a complete sellout to all of the wrong people. And this is business as usual for the federal government.
Of course, it didn't stop, Senator Rick Scott from criticizing. He says it's 3 times the size of the Bible. That's the Democrats' spending. I mean, how much of it was compromised to get his vote? I mean, that's just
Democrats coming to bat for $858 billion in defense spending. They're trying to spend it on veterans. Republicans don't want to do that.
Yeah, no, it's just, I mean, some of the Republicans wanted to just do a temporary fix to extend it to January so that they'd have more leverage when they took over the House. But I think there were even some House Republicans that just said, you know what, I don't want to get caught up in that politics. I've only got 2 years. If I don't make my mark, I'm going to be voted out. I got, it's they barely survived this time around. So.
Yeah, I think it is interesting that they didn't, just kick it a little way forward. And again, I do think that there's like kind of echoes or a legacy of the midterms here, maybe feeling a little bit more rattled, just wanting to get a win on this one and, swallow the pill, I guess, as they would look at it and move on. I think it's interesting when we look at what the Democrats did get: $58 billion for highway funding, $1 billion more for CHIPS and Science Act. This is just in some of the bipartisan priorities that we see in that proposal that was put out. More federal funding for child care is important. Healthcare funding and access to research they're listing is really, really important. They're continuing to go to bat for mental health care and the opiate, crisis that we have and things like that. And food insecurity. Like, I think that all of this stuff is really, really important, and I'm happy to see it getting more money. But again, this is 722 of a $1.7 trillion package.
Yes.
And if we want to extend the metaphor, if 1 million seconds is 12 days and 1 billion seconds is 31 years, 1 trillion seconds is 31,000 years,
right?
Which is like Paleolithic. We got to spend this money better. We have plenty. We have more than enough money. It's not a question of whether or not the United States can afford certain things. It's about whether we're spending on value-added principles and investing in our country or, funding war, which I think is a fantastic segue for what we're about to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely.
Friends, I'm proud to greet you from Ukraine, from our capital city of Kyiv, a city that is under missile and airstrikes from Russian troops every day, but it doesn't give up. And I have the honor to greet you on behalf of the Ukrainian people, brave and freedom-loving people who for 8 years have been resisting the Russian aggression. Those who give their best sons and daughters to stop this full-scale Russian invasion. Right now, the destiny of our country is being decided. The destiny of our people.
All right, brings us to our final segment. The Ukrainian president, Zelinsky, came to Congress, spoke to Congress, a very rare trip. He actually had been at the front of the battle, making a speech where he could have easily been hit by artillery as the battle was going on. Brave guy, came very little criticism of him from people who have been critical of him, either from the anti-war left or from the isolationist right. They're a little bit of the people. There's been talk, McCarthy saying, well, we don't want to have a blank check, whatever that means, and a little bit of talks about like decreasing funding for him. But the war has gone about as well as it could for a country like Ukraine to be fighting a superpower with the weapons that they have. But Ukraine has been incrementally winning, but also losing some here and there. But retook Kherson last month, and that was a big, huge deal. And now right now Russia is basically attacking the infrastructure, attacking heat in the winter, just wanting to kill and make civilians suffer, basically, thinking that this is going to actually, drive down their spirit, not learning from their own history that actually in situations like that with an invading country, it actually boosts the defense. I mean, he doesn't even understand what happened in World War II. He's basically in Hitler's position from a military position is that way. But anyway, Zelensky came to Washington. Everybody loved him, or at least said they did. He had a great joint meeting with President Biden. He met with Republicans. He's trying not to be too partisan, even though he's very grateful that Biden has really pushed through the aid up until now, and Republicans and even the Marjorie Taylor Greene and all that were very muted while he was here, and have been muted since. Aaron, what do we have to say about this in terms of the impact of that visit and the recent aspects of the war in Ukraine, and bearing in mind that there's talks that the Patriot missile will be supplying them with that? Is that an escalation? Well, it really is only used to shoot down missiles to protect civilians, essentially. But anyway, a lot to talk about there, and I'll let you get started.
I think the visit to Washington, D.C. For President Zelensky is the bigger escalation, frankly, than any arms shipment that we've seen to date. I think you're right that Ukraine's done as well as it can, based in large part because of billions of dollars over decades being spent by NATO to make sure that they're prepared for precisely this kind of moment. Vladimir Putin is no mystery when it comes to the way that he conducts business. From day one, he likes to create violent conflicts and try to exploit those violent conflicts for political gain. We see this throughout his career. I think that what's fascinating to me is to compare his visit to the one in 2019 when Donald Trump came. There's a just really splendid photo comparison of Zelensky sitting there looking at Donald Trump like a man who just shook him down, and then a picture of Zelensky sitting there talking to Joe Biden like a world equal fighting a war, being welcomed to the president, to the White House to talk with the president. It is a completely different vocabulary. And I think that given the gains that Ukraine has made in recent months and right up to winter anyway, given the clear and just kind of abject depravity of the Russian war effort, the initiation of the war, there is very little that anyone can stand on in terms of critiquing, this particular effort. As a pacifist, I reject war in pretty much every instance. As a principled pacifist, I'm never going to participate in making war if I can help it. My tax dollars are a huge accountability that I have to square myself with. But I think that when it comes to Washington politics, it's hard for folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene to say that she would win the January 6th insurrection because she would come armed, and then, try to talk trash about Zelensky, who has been literally, as you said, standing feet away from actual shelling.
She was trying to be funny when she said that. It fell flat even on that crowd, but she was trying.
I don't know, man. I saw the whole comment. Everyone's like, you got to see it in context, and so I did. And weirdly, she's a person who I am studying for a living right now. Her and Donald Trump. I'm like, my life is to study these people for work. I can't believe it. But I mean, they're gonna say it was a joke, but it's a very specific joke. And when you look at how violent that moment was, I don't know. What I will tell you is that while they're like dilly-dallying over there, blaming Antifa for something that they very clearly did, Zelensky is standing on the front line, taking shells, telling Russia to just do whatever they want, and the Ukrainians are going to fight back. Russia really thought he was going to flee. It is incredible to remember that this person was like a comedian on television who got elected president and is now one of the most striking examples of military leadership in contemporary history. Pretty fascinating. So the PR coup is one thing. On the other side, in terms of what the war is looking like, it's just catastrophic. The chairman of the Joint U.S. Chief of Staff, Mark Milley, he says 100,000 dead on both sides, 40K civilians have died. 6 to 7.2 million people have been displaced internally and throughout Europe. It's like 3.6 million, something like 3 million in Poland, 960,000 in Romania, 900,000 into Russia itself, Hungary, Moldova, Slovakia, Belarus, just a wave of refugees, really testing, not only fairly fragile liberal policies on immigration that the EU and other organizations have cobbled together, but also potentially really fueling a bunch of anti-immigrant populist rhetoric, in spite of the fact that people are sympathetic to war refugees. It's a catastrophe. It's not ending anytime soon. I don't see any military off-ramp at all, and this only escalates it, right?
I agree. I mean, he's talked about a peace plan, but he's very vague on the points. And
Right.
And the thing that nobody really wants to discuss with peace talks is, does this mean Ukraine gives up land? And that's a whole issue. Now, if it wasn't for the war itself, if Russia hadn't invaded in 2014, you could actually kind of make a historic case that Russia has more of a claim to the Crimean Peninsula than Ukraine, kind of. I mean, yeah, it's iffy because we don't know the impact of the Holodomor on whether and why so many Russian, ethnic and speaking people live there to begin with. But it was part of Russia after they took it, when it was after it was its own Islamic state back in the 19th century, right? And Stalin, just figuring that the Soviet Union was going to hold together, just made it part of Ukraine, kind of as an arbitrary decision. But the point is now that an invasion has happened, you can't give it to him, arguably, at least as the argument goes, because then it rewards an invasion. We can't have that precedent. I mean, it's a difficult thing. So what does Ukraine have to offer in peace talks that will at least give Putin, allow him to save face and the war? It's a tricky question. I don't know the answer to that.
One of the examples I use quite a bit, Eric, is if I just decided today that you owe me $1,000 and I'm saying you owe me $1,000 and you're like, I don't owe you $1,000. And someone who has no context at all shows up and they ask what we're fighting about. I'm going to be like, well, Eric owes me $1,000. And you're going to be like, I don't. At some point, someone's going to say, well, why not just compromise and give him $200?
Right.
Just compromise and give him $150. And that sounds like a huge compromise, but what it is in fact is theft. It's extortion. It is someone using the appearance of some kind of negotiation to justify a shakedown. And again, this is Putin from the very, very beginning. When you look at the history of so-called terrorist attacks to incursions on sovereign territories, there's lots of ways that he could make the argument for Russian sovereignty of this land, based on what he remembers Russia being from before World War II. But the way that he does it is just completely reckless, completely it flies in the face of any international norms, which means there's a real difficult solution. Like, what do we do? How do you solve someone that is going to take absolutely every inch that he can? Kind of has echoes of Trumpism in my mind in the United States, right? They're going to take everything that you can, and then you have to compromise by giving them a fraction of that, which is something they weren't even owed. I don't know. I think that when we look at NATO's, ability to keep Ukraine up, that is not going anywhere, and that is substantial. I think that the missile systems, the anti-tank systems that we've talked about on this show in the past, particularly the influx of the Javelin and the munitions for the Javelin, which are very, very difficult to come by, those have been very, very meaningful. The potential, drone support, the internet support, all of that's come through the West and through NATO has been very, very significant. Russia's incompetence and Russia's unwillingness to go all in have been the primary reasons that this has not ended more quickly. And if Putin has the backing, this is what's really hard to know. No one knows what's going on inside those private hallways in Russia, and whether Putin's enemies have any real stance to challenge him. Because if not, it's possible he could really increase, he could escalate. And there's reports that that's what he's looking to do. We're seeing the shelling now, so it's possible.
It is possible, but I tend to wonder if he was going to do that, why hasn't he done it up until now? Why did he wait until winter to do it? And I wonder if he's worried about whether or not he's got full support within the military. You know, is it because that would require a lot of commanders involved in coordination of it, and it makes me wonder if he's got, you know, he seems to be ruling with an iron hand, but I wonder how confident he is that he's got the full support of the military on this, and that's why they haven't gone all out. Because I mean, yeah, they should have done it right away, but I think that they didn't do it right away because everybody thought they didn't have to, that the Ukrainian military was going to collapse just with it. And when we say all out, you know, let's remember they had 200,000 people they were invading with.
Pretty aggressive invasion.
It was a pretty impressive invasion. It wasn't like they just, you know, sent a few, you know, troops in to harass Ukraine. It was pretty big. That would take a huge mobilization, and then we've got to talk about what Russia's economic capacity are to put that on. It's one thing to have the military, but to be able to pull everything together, to be able to do it, and then what are the consequences of that? You know, where does it weaken them elsewhere, and the rest? And so it may happen, but I just tend to wonder if it's going to happen, why hasn't it happened up until now? What is he waiting for? There's obviously something.
Even if it doesn't, I think it's, you know, obviously history is just full of examples of empires getting themselves into military quagmires. The United States ended a 20-year war in Afghanistan where trillions were spent and millions were killed and millions more were displaced. And the big difference there is that the economy did not freeze on us when we decided to do that. We, in fact, retained our position of preeminence when it comes to determining economic sanctions and things. Russia has been slammed with economic sanctions, and the gears are just getting tighter and tighter and tighter. And even if they decide to cut off oil the way that they are, like as you said, I think history has shown us the colder you make the civilians, the more patriotic they're going to be. It translates directly into a direct form of resistance. It makes everyone feel like a soldier fighting on the front, and that leads to support. And that makes it very hard to continue to invade. So I think that either way, whether there's a major escalation or just this kind of, you know, it could be a 15, 20-year grind here, depending on how hard it is to dislodge Putin. The big question is whether the economic situation makes it impossible for him to stay in control.
So the question is what are the impacts? What is the impact going to be domestically? You know, we have there's kind of mixed feelings about the war and how much money we're spending on it, and you know, a lot of those aspects, and whether or not this could trigger World War III. You know, there's it's not likely, but it's far from impossible. It's just that something like this could happen. Everybody's on. You know, we've seen a lot of scenarios where World War III gets started accidentally because everybody's on edge, and we haven't been on this kind of edge in decades now. It's kind of a new thing. Now we don't have as many nuclear weapons as we used to by far. We had a huge reduction of them, but enough that that if not billions, certainly hundreds of millions would be dead within days.
And there's just whole places that the conflict can go that we really have no context for. I think when we take a look at the way that cyberspace could be weaponized, the way that outer space could be weaponized in ways that we really just have not confronted, like we just don't know much about what's going on in outer space or cyberspace as far as the Russians are concerned. We know when their rockets go up, and we know generally what is spinning around, you know, up there, but there's a lot of uncertainties. And I think that especially if they feel incapacitated on the military like front, that is the opportunity to plausibly, deniably start the war in other places, especially when you see Zelinsky getting so cozy with the president of the United States. I think if Biden were to win re-election, I do not want him to run. But if he runs and if he wins and Putin is still in power, that's just all the more reason for him to continue. Domestically, the impact on him is really impossible to tell. It is famously one of the countries that is really hard to speak up in opposition about the sitting president. And my guess is the closer you get to him, the more true that is. So it's the kind of thing that could sort itself out tomorrow with a headline that the guy has been either, you know, exiled or killed, or it could be a 15, 20-year quagmire, or it could escalate. I definitely think it could escalate in ways that are very hard to predict.
Well, in the less than 2 minutes we have left, we will be discussing this. How is it going to impact the presidential race? Now, the presidential race, like it or not, has started. We don't know who the candidates are going to be yet necessarily, but
Except for Donald Trump, who has been hanging out at his golf course since he announced his candidacy. I don't understand it.
yeah, but that could be a gimmick to raise money too. Does he really intend to run? Who knows?
Doesn't look like he's running.
Yeah, no, he certainly hasn't put together any committees or anything. Well, meanwhile, we've got other potential Republican candidates, and of course, the big question is going to be on as to whether or not Biden is going to renew, his presidency. And so the question really is how will this war play into that? Because I noticed the Republicans were not only not critical of Zelinsky, but they weren't even really critical of Biden for the most part. A few comments here and there, but nothing that really made any headlines.
It was surprisingly quiet. I don't know, that this will be one of the issues that they're going to go at Biden for. I think it's interesting that Republicans have tossed up the idea that they might potentially cut funding to this. I think that as far as the opinion of the world is concerned, what Russia did was egregious. What Ukrainians are doing is, in the eyes of so many people, very, very heroic. NATO is doing exactly what it was built to do. And I think that Biden is kind of a good relic of the legacy of neoliberalism that really created and propped up organizations like NATO. And you would think it would be one of the places because we spend so much money on it. But especially if Ukraine continues to hold fast or make ground, then it's hard. If Ukraine were to buckle, if Russia were to escalate and just start rolling and it were to look hopeless for Ukraine, then I think it could impact the election.
All right. Well, we'll be talking about that more, obviously, in the future. All right, this brings us to the end of the show predictions. Next to the last show of the year. What do you got, Aaron?
Well, I think that the Department of Justice is going to at least pursue one of the 4 criminal indictments. I don't know that they're going to go for more than one. I definitely don't think they're going to go for 4. But I think at least some of the stuff about conspiring to defraud the people and stuff like that, the record is clear. They cannot do nothing. Rather than go for all 4, we're going to see them pursue maybe 1.
All right. That wasn't going to be my prediction, but I think there are going to be charges with regard to the records that he took, and so they'll probably throw in
also that.
Yeah, the incitement one with the special prosecutor on it. Now, I actually think charges are going to be filed. I think when that decision was made, they would be filed. Real quickly. I don't think either. This is my prediction here. It could blow up in my face, but I think Biden is going to run for re-election, barring some medical issue. I do not think Trump is going to run. I think he just cannot handle the possibility of losing. So it's looking like it'll probably be Biden versus DeSantis in 2024. It's early, but that's my prediction at this point. And
I think you're right, and I think DeSantis could beat him.
Depending on the circumstances, yes.
We'll see.
All right. Well, thank you very much for standing in on this kind of a special edition from my office. But we'll be back next week. Until next time, stay informed and stay engaged.